The night was heavy with dust and smoke, as if Rome itself exhaled exhaustion. Somewhere in the labyrinth of the Subura district, a cry cut through the silence, a child's cry, frail yet defiant. Gaius Julius Caesar had entered a world already crumbling, a republic that spoke of virtue while drowning in decay. The marble columns still gleamed, but their foundations were rotting. Senators debated liberty in the morning, then sold it by dusk. In that airless city, the child who would one day unmake Rome took his first breath. They said his family traced its bloodline to Venus Genetrix, the goddess of love. It was a claim both sacred and political, a reminder that in Rome, even divinity was currency. The Julii were old patricians, noble in title but poor in gold. In their narrow house, Caesar's mother, Aurelia, preserved dignity with ritual precision, while his father drifted through the waning ranks of Roman nobility. They dressed their son in the language of greatness long before he could speak it. To be born a Caesar was not privilege, it was expectation. Outside, the Republic groaned. The Senate had become a theater of power, where corruption applauded itself. Debt choked farmers. The legions, once Rome's proud sword, were now instruments of private ambition. The city fed on conquest, yet its soul starved. It was an age of strong men rising over broken laws. One of them was Gaius Marius, Caesar's uncle by marriage, a soldier who had risen from obscurity to reshape the republic in his image. Another was Lucius Cornelius Sulla, a patrician general whose ruthlessness rivaled the gods themselves. Their feud would stain Rome red, and Caesar, still a boy, would learn the taste of fear from its ashes. When Sulla seized power, his proscriptions began, a bureaucratic slaughter. Lists were nailed to walls, names crossed out with daggers. The city became a hunt. Men of influence vanished overnight, their estates seized, their sons sold, their daughters widowed before marriage. In those days, the young Caesar was ordered to renounce his wife, Cornelia, the daughter of Cinna, a loyalist of Marius, Sulla's enemy. Refusal meant death. Obedience meant survival. Caesar chose defiance. The boy who had never commanded a legion now defied the most powerful man in Rome. They took his property. They hunted him across the Italian countryside. In the marshes of Campania, he hid, thin and fevered, with only loyalty and luck for companions. Yet even in flight, he carried himself like a man the world would one day remember. When Sulla's men found him, he bribed them with words sharper than coins. In this Caesar, Sulla is said to have warned his allies, there are many Mariuses. He let the young man live, not out of mercy, but out of calculation. A wolf pup, he thought, might still be tamed. He was wrong. Freedom led Caesar not to peace but to the sea. Pirates captured him near the island of Pharmacusa. They demanded 20 talents of silver for his ransom. He laughed and told them they should have asked for 50. During captivity, he was neither hostage nor victim, he was command itself in flesh. He recited poetry to his captors, mocked their ignorance, joined their games, and promised, half in jest, that he would return to crucify them. They laughed too, until, weeks later, he kept his promise. After his ransom was paid, Caesar raised a small fleet, hunted the pirates down, and crucified them all. Yet, in an act of cold mercy, he ordered their throats cut before the agony began. Even his vengeance carried refinement. Rome took notice. He returned to the city a changed man, no longer the fugitive boy, but a figure with gravity. He studied rhetoric under Apollonius and Rhodes, mastering the weapon that would serve him more than any sword, speech. When he spoke, crowds listened not for entertainment, but for revelation. His voice was the sound of conviction draped in elegance, his gestures precise, his presence magnetic. To his allies, he was promise, to his enemies, prophecy. The Republic had seen ambitious men before, but never one so fluent in destiny. Rome itself was unraveling. The gap between rich and poor widened into a chasm. Grain riots echoed through the streets. Slave revolts shook the countryside. The Senate, paralyzed by fear, turned its gaze inward, inventing enemies where it should have found reform. Caesar watched and learned. He saw that power did not merely belong to those who claimed it, it belonged to those who could make others believe they already had it. He entered politics with precision, winning minor offices not by force, but by charm. He spent lavishly, borrowing fortunes he did not possess, promising repayment from victories not yet won. Every debt was an investment in his myth. When he stood to speak in the forum, the people saw not a patrician but a reflection of their hunger. He knew the art of being many men at once, noble to the nobles, savior to the poor, threat to the complacent. Behind the calm of his demeanor burned an unrelenting hunger, the need to control chaos by becoming it. Rome, he realized, no longer needed a hero. It needed an architect of inevitability. In the ruins of its virtue, he saw his path. Power was not taken by the sword, it was taken by the story told about who deserved it. Caesar began writing his own. As years passed, his alliances deepened and his patience sharpened. He courted the powerful and seduced the crowd, binding them with promises of reform and revenge. Each gesture was calculation disguised as compassion. To some, he was hope reborn, to others, a storm gathering just beyond the horizon. But even those who hated him could not look away. There was something in his gaze, something that suggested he had already seen the future, and it was carved in his image. By the time he returned from his early campaigns, the boy who once defied Sulla had become a man whose defiance could shake empires. The Republic was weary, its guardians blind. They did not yet understand that in their struggle to preserve power, they had already surrendered it. For in the heart of one man, the Republic's contradictions had found their final form, mercy and ambition, loyalty and betrayal, bound in one name that history would never silence. Rome slept uneasily, unaware that the footsteps already echoing through its marble corridors belonged to its last true son. The empire to come was still an unborn shadow, but its pulse had begun. And as the city lights flickered across the Tiber, one truth lingered like a whisper in the dark: power had found its prophet. Morning mist curled above the forests of Gaul, thick as breath upon a mirror. Beneath it, thousands of Roman soldiers waited, silent, armored, and cold. The dew on their shields glimmered like dying stars. In front of them stood a man whose ambition now stretched beyond the known world. Gaius Julius Caesar had become governor of Gaul, but the title was too small for the hunger that stirred within him. Before him lay not merely tribes and territories, but immortality itself. Rome had granted him command over distant provinces, expecting war, tribute, and silence. But Caesar saw something else, a stage large enough to outshine every rival in the Republic. Each campaign, each village burned, each enemy conquered would not just feed Rome, it would feed his legend. His letters to the Senate began to read like scripture. Commentarii de Bello Gallico, reports of conquest written in the third person, as if history itself had already accepted his divinity. The Gauls were not one people but a storm of nations, fierce, divided, and proud. They fought with fire in their eyes, painted with the earth they defended. To Caesar, they were both obstacle and instrument. For every tribe he crushed, another rose to avenge it, allowing his army to march endlessly, his glory to grow without pause. To the soldiers who followed him, he was not a commander but a force of nature, relentless, watchful, never sleeping. He shared their hardships, ate their bread, crossed rivers waist-deep in winter floods. Yet behind that solidarity was calculation. A general who could make his men love him could also make them die for him. His victories came like thunderclaps. At the Sambra, at the Seine, at the Loire, tribes fell in waves. Whole villages were erased, their ashes turned to symbols of Rome's dominion. The legions learned to move like a single living machine, flesh, iron, and wool fused under Caesar's eye. He rewarded courage, punished hesitation, and believed that fear was the purest form of discipline. But even as the eagle standards rose higher, something darker stirred beneath the triumphs. For each victory, the soil drank deeper of blood. The fields of Gaul whispered a question Rome refused to hear: what would remain after such glory? Among the tribes, one man dared to answer. His name was Vercingetorix, the young chieftain of the Arverni, fierce and defiant, carved from the very earth of Gaul. He rose not for gold or pride but for survival, uniting warring clans under a single banner. In his eyes burned the last light of resistance. For the first time, Caesar faced not chaos but cohesion, a mirror of his own ambition. The war that followed would test not armies but wills. The campaign against Vercingetorix was unlike any before. Caesar's legions marched through fire and famine, their discipline clashing against the Gauls' desperation. Villages were burned to deny Rome supplies, bridges torn down to starve its advance. The land itself became a weapon. But Caesar did not retreat. He adapted, improvised, and endured. His strategy was not just to conquer bodies but to break spirits. He understood that to rule forever, one must first teach obedience to despair. It all came to a head at Alesia, a hilltop fortress surrounded by valleys and rivers. There, Vercingetorix made his stand, drawing Caesar into the jaws of impossibility. The Gauls held the high ground, their numbers vast, their hearts unbroken. To siege them seemed madness. Yet Caesar saw opportunity in the impossible. With cold precision, he ordered a line of fortifications, walls, trenches, traps, encircling the fortress like a tightening noose. When news came that a second Gaulish army was marching to relieve Alesia, Caesar did not flinch. Instead, he built a second wall, this one facing outward, to trap himself between two enemies. Inside and outside, the storm would break. For days, the sky trembled with war. Arrows hissed like rain. The ground itself became a graveyard of mud and armor. Roman engineering met Gallic fury in a contest of endurance that felt more ritual than battle. Caesar moved along the ramparts, cloaked crimson against the smoke, his calm unbroken even as death pressed in from both sides. He was no longer merely a general, he was an idea made flesh, a symbol of inevitability. When at last the outer army broke and the inner fortress fell, silence followed. Vercingetorix, proud even in defeat, rode out to surrender. He removed his armor, threw his sword at Caesar's feet, and waited for the verdict history had already written. Caesar spared him, for a time. Vercingetorix was paraded in Rome years later, chained and broken, displayed before the roaring crowds as living proof of Rome's supremacy. When the festival ended, he was strangled in the darkness beneath the Tullianum prison. Glory demanded sacrifice, and even heroes were currency. By the end of the Gallic campaigns, Caesar had conquered not only land but legend. 8 years of war had filled his coffers, his ranks, and his name with power beyond measure. Rome, once distant, now feared his return. His commentaries circulated like gospel, describing battles with divine detachment. Each word, each sentence, sculpted his image, merciful, brilliant, unstoppable. The truth beneath them was more complicated. The fields of Gaul were graveyards, and their silence was bought with iron. Yet Caesar did not see death, he saw destiny. He wrote not as man but as monument, convinced that history would forgive cruelty if it admired greatness. To him, conquest was not the means to power, it was its proof. The Republic could no longer contain what it had unleashed. The Senate trembled behind its columns, whispering his name like a prayer or a curse. Pompey, once his ally and son-in-law, now stood against him, the embodiment of an order Caesar no longer recognized. As Caesar prepared to leave Gaul, he looked back across the rivers he had crossed, the mountains he had conquered, and the thousands who had died in his shadow. The smoke of victory drifted into the northern sky, merging with the mists that had once greeted him. He had turned barbarians into subjects, soldiers into instruments, war into memory. But in doing so, he had also forged something Rome would soon fear more than any enemy, a man who believed himself necessary. The conquest of Gaul was complete, but the war for Rome had only begun. The legions that had followed him through fire would now march home. And as they turned their gaze toward the Rubicon, their loyalty no longer belonged to the Republic, it belonged to Caesar. In that loyalty, history felt the first tremor of collapse. The world was shifting, quietly, inevitably. Beyond the forests, the rivers, the broken walls, one truth lingered in the air. When a man conquers everything outside himself, he must one day face what remains within. Night lay heavy over northern Italy. A river murmured beneath the dark, a narrow, unremarkable stream called the Rubicon. Its waters shimmered faintly under the weight of an unseen choice. On one bank stood Caesar, silent, wrapped in his crimson cloak, the color of both triumph and treason. Behind him, his legions waited, men who had bled for him in Gaul, men whose loyalty had outgrown the Republic itself. Before him, the frontier of law, beyond which lay civil war. Between them, history held its breath. Rome had changed while he was away. The Senate, once his ally, now viewed him as contagion. Pompey the Great, once his friend and son-in-law, had turned executioner of the Republic's will. They demanded Caesar lay down his arms, return as a private citizen, and stand trial for the wars that had made him powerful. But Caesar knew the meaning behind their words. Trial was not justice. It was erasure. The Senate feared not his crimes, but his success. To obey would be to vanish. To defy would be to become eternal. He stared into the black water, feeling the pulse of inevitability in its current. The Rubicon was not wide, but crossing it meant the death of law, the birth of legend. The die was not yet cast, but already in his hand. A single step would divide centuries. He turned to his men, eyes cold, voice calm, Alia iacta est. The die is cast. The hooves entered the stream, and the world broke. Word spread through the Republic like wildfire through dry reeds. The Senate fled Rome in panic. Pompey withdrew to the south, gathering his forces. The streets emptied, statues toppled, temples closed. The city that had ruled the world trembled before its own creation. Caesar did not enter in triumph, but in silence. There was no resistance, only absence. The Republic did not die with a roar, it sighed. The people lined the streets not with defiance, but with awe. They did not cheer a conqueror, they welcomed inevitability. Civil war followed like shadow after flame. Rome's legions, once brothers, now faced each other across fields once blessed by peace. Caesar's march was methodical, relentless. Each battle carried not just strategy but symbolism. At Corfinium, he spared defeated enemies, offering mercy where others expected vengeance. Mercy, he knew, was power disguised as virtue. Each act of clemency deepened his legend, turning opponents into witnesses. Pompey, cautious and proud, withdrew to Greece, his strength built on numbers, his confidence on tradition. Caesar followed, not as an aggressor but as destiny incarnate. At Pharsalus, under the pale light of a Grecian dawn, two visions of Rome collided. Pompey's army stretched wide across the plains, glittering like a sea of iron. Caesar's men were outnumbered, weary, veterans of too many campaigns, but they were his. When the trumpets sounded, they did not hear orders, they heard faith. The battle was swift and terrible. Pompey's cavalry broke, his legions faltered, and in the dust, the Republic gasped its final breath. Caesar stood among the dead, his armor streaked with mud and blood, his expression unreadable. Victory brought no joy, only confirmation. Rome had chosen its master. Pompey fled, desperate, seeking refuge in Egypt. There, on a foreign shore, he was betrayed. The boy King Ptolemy, fearing Caesar's wrath, offered a grotesque gift, Pompey's severed head. When Caesar saw it, he did not rejoice. He turned away, eyes hollow. This was once greatness, he murmured, and wept. In that moment, the conqueror mourned not a rival, but the illusion of Rome's moral order. The Republic's dignity had died not by the sword, but by convenience. In Alexandria, the air shimmered with incense and intrigue. Cleopatra, exiled queen and living symbol of Egypt's defiance, entered Caesar's life not as seduction, but as reflection. She was cunning, eloquent, and unafraid, a woman who understood that survival was the truest form of conquest. Their alliance was as political as it was human, born not of passion alone, but of recognition. Each saw in the other what the world feared most, sovereignty of will. In her chambers, beneath the painted ceilings of vanished gods, the empire of Caesar met the empire of beauty. From their union would come a son, Caesarion, the bloodline of both Rome and the Nile. But even that legacy was a ripple against the tide of what Caesar was becoming. When he returned to Rome, it was not as general, but as ruler. The Senate, cowed and trembling, named him Dictator Perpetuo, dictator for life. The Republic, that old and fragile experiment in shared power, now knelt at one man's feet. To some, he was savior, to others, tyrant. But all understood one thing: Rome was no longer a republic. It was becoming a reflection of a single will. Still, Caesar spoke of reform, of rebuilding, forgiving, reshaping. He passed laws to stabilize the economy, extend citizenship, and restore order to provinces gutted by war. But beneath the surface, unease festered. The senators who crowned him with praise whispered betrayal in their corridors. They saw not a restorer, but a king in all but name. For centuries, Rome had sworn never to kneel before one man again, and yet, it had. At feasts, Caesar sat apart, a figure of light in distance. His friends saw his charm, his enemies saw his shadow. Power had changed him, not by corruption, but by isolation. The man who once fought for the people now seemed carved from the marble of the gods. When he entered the Senate, the air stiffened. When he spoke, the world paused. He had become what Rome both desired and feared, a living symbol of its contradictions. Yet even Caesar, with all his foresight, could not sense the gathering storm within the very chamber that now obeyed him. There, among men he had spared, among those who owed him everything, grew the whisper of liberation. They called themselves liberatores, the liberators. They believed that by killing him, they could resurrect the Republic. But what they did not understand was that the Republic had already died long before Caesar's ascent. It had perished in its own vanity, its own fear. As the year turned, omens multiplied. A comet burned in the night sky. The soothsayers muttered warnings. Yet Caesar dismissed them with weary grace. He had lived too long in prophecy to fear it. His confidence had become armor, his destiny his only belief. He looked upon Rome and saw perfection, his own reflection in marble and flame. What he could not see were the knives already being sharpened in the dark. The Rubicon was behind him now, but another crossing awaited, a final river, one no man could return from. And as the Senate prepared its theater of loyalty, Rome held its breath once more. The empire was still unborn, but its shadow had already fallen across the world. The morning of October 16, 1793, dawned gray and cold over Paris. Clouds hung low over the rooftops, heavy and bruised with rain, as though the heavens themselves refused to look upon what was to come. Inside the dank stone walls of the conciergerie, Marie Antoinette sat upright on her narrow bed, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Her hair, once powdered and perfumed, had turned an ashen gray. It wasn't vanity that made her reach for the broken shard of a mirror that morning, it was memory. The reflection staring back at her was no longer the radiant queen of Versailles, but a hollow figure stripped of everything but dignity. When the jailer entered, his torchlight flickered across the iron bars. "It's time," he muttered, avoiding her eyes. She gave a small nod, the gesture of a woman who had long surrendered to inevitability. There was no struggle left in her, only composure, the last weapon she possessed against a world determined to humiliate her. As she stood, the chains on her ankles clinked like distant bells. The young guards assigned to escort her hesitated. One of them, barely older than her own son, couldn't bear to meet her gaze. She noticed the tremor in his hand and offered a faint smile. "Courage, monsieur," she whispered, her voice still carrying the warmth of a queen addressing her subject. They led her through the narrow corridors of the prison, past walls stained with damp and despair. Outside, the cart awaited. It was no carriage, no royal procession, just a rough wooden cart used to transport criminals. She climbed aboard without assistance. The crowd that had gathered to watch fell silent for a heartbeat. Then came the jeers, the shouts, the laughter of those who once bowed to her in silks and jewels. "Look! The widow Capet rides to her wedding," someone cried. Laughter erupted, cruel and hollow. But she kept her gaze forward, her spine unbroken. The wheels groaned as the cart rolled across the cobblestones, each turn echoing like a drumbeat. Along the streets of Paris, windows opened and shutters banged. Some hurled insults, others tossed scraps of paper or wilted flowers. Yet, scattered among them were faces that did not sneer. A baker's wife wiped her eyes with her apron. An old soldier, scarred from the American War, saluted her quietly from the shadows. Marie's eyes caught his gesture, and for a moment her lips parted in something like gratitude. She had learned, at last, that respect was not born from titles, but from grace under ruin. As the procession neared the Place de la Révolution, the crowd swelled into a roaring sea. The guillotine stood tall at its center, gleaming coldly under the dull light. The blade, sharp, patient, inevitable, seemed to breathe in the city's rage. When the cart stopped, she stood with calm precision. The priest beside her murmured prayers, but she barely heard them. Her mind drifted to the laughter of her children, to the gardens of Versailles, to Louis's gentle awkwardness when he'd first confessed his love. Every memory, sweet or bitter, folded into her chest like letters sealed for another world. She stepped down carefully, her feet sinking into the wet earth. The executioner reached out to steady her, and as she turned, her shoe caught his foot. "Pardon me, monsieur," she said softly, the last words she would ever speak. The crowd hushed. For all their hatred, they could not deny her composure. She climbed the scaffold alone. The wind tugged at her simple white gown, lifting the ends of the ribbon tied around her neck. The sky broke open then, rain falling in thin, slanted sheets. The executioner's assistants bound her hands, pulled her hair back. She did not flinch. When they lowered her toward the plank, she looked out over the crowd one final time. It wasn't the city she had ruled, it was the city that had consumed her. And yet, in her eyes, there was no hatred. Only sorrow. The blade fell with a hiss. The crowd erupted in cheers, thunderous and chaotic. But for an instant, just before the noise swallowed everything, the rain struck the wood with a hollow rhythm, like a heartbeat fading into silence. And somewhere beyond that square, the Seine carried the echo of a woman who had once been queen, washed clean of her sins, her splendor, and her sorrow.